Today, we are covering 6 major breaking developments that are reshaping the global order. First, Trump says the U.S. could end the war with Iran in 2 to 3 weeks. Second, Iran's foreign minister declares the country is not seeking a ceasefire, but a complete end to the war. Third, the Pentagon has made bunker construction for American bases in the Middle East a top priority. Fourth, Russia loses over $1 billion in a single week as Ukrainian drone attacks devastate its oil export infrastructure. Fifth, Russian military voices are urging the Kremlin to seek peace, according to the Institute for the Study of War. And sixth, Ukraine accuses Russia of deliberately redirecting drones into Finland and the Baltic states as a calculated provocation. These are not isolated events. They are pieces of the same collapsing structure. Let's get into it. On March 31st, 2026, President Donald Trump made the clearest statement yet about his intentions in the ongoing U.S. military campaign against Iran. Speaking to reporters in the Oval Office, Trump said the United States would be leaving very soon, adding that the exit could happen within 2 weeks, maybe 3, for a conflict that has already lasted 1 month, reorganized the Middle East, rattled global energy markets, and fundamentally altered the trajectory of his presidency. Those words carry enormous weight. But here is where it gets really interesting. Trump also said Iran does not need to make a deal with Washington for the conflict to end. When asked whether successful diplomacy was a prerequisite for the U.S. to stop military operations, Trump was direct. No, they don't need to make a deal with me. Instead, he framed the condition for withdrawal as Iran being set back to what he called the Stone Age, meaning a country without the near-term capacity to acquire a nuclear weapon. Once that threshold is reached, in Trump's view, the U.S. walks away. That is a very different kind of war termination logic than what the world has seen from Washington in decades. No peace treaty, no formal agreement, just destruction of capability and departure. And on the Iranian side, the picture is equally complex. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi made clear on the same day that Tehran is not interested in a ceasefire. What Iran wants, according to Araghchi, is a complete end to the war across the entire region, with guarantees against future attacks and compensation for damages already inflicted. He also clarified the nature of the ongoing communications between Iran and the United States. These are not negotiations, he said. They are an exchange of messages, transmitted directly or through regional intermediaries. U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff has been sending messages, but Araghchi was explicit. Do not interpret that as formal talks. The messages flow through Iran's foreign ministry and through security channels under the supervision of the Supreme National Security Council. He also addressed reports that Iran had responded to 15 American proposals, flatly denying that any response was sent and stating that Tehran has not submitted any proposals or conditions of its own. And on the question of the Strait of Hormuz, Araghchi said it remains fully open and will only be restricted to parties actively engaged in hostilities against Iran. That is a critical signal to the global energy market, and we will come back to why in a moment. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, the consequences of 1 month of war in the Middle East are becoming visible in real time. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth confirmed on March 31st that the construction of hardened shelters to better protect American forces at bases across the Middle East has become a top priority. This announcement came after an Iranian attack last week destroyed a U.S. E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, a highly sophisticated airborne warning and control system aircraft, while it was sitting in the open. The loss of an asset like that is not just a military embarrassment. It is a strategic signal that American forces in the region were exposed in ways that should have been addressed long before the first shots were fired. Hegseth spoke about dispersal of forces, rapid deployment of bunker infrastructure, layered air defenses including Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, fighter jets on defensive combat air patrol, kinetic neutralization systems, and electronic warfare capabilities. All of that is valuable. But the question that serious analysts are asking is why these reinforcements were not in place months earlier, given that the conflict was preceded by extensive planning and that Iranian drone and missile capabilities were already well understood. This is a lesson being learned the hard way, in real time, with real consequences. Now shift your attention to Eastern Europe, because what is happening in Russia right now is extraordinary. Between March 22nd and March 29th, 2026, Ukraine's military executed a sustained drone campaign against two of Russia's most critical oil export hubs, the ports of U.S. Teluga and Primorsk, both located on the Baltic Sea. The results were devastating. Russian oil exports from the Baltic region fell to one-third of the previous week's volume. Total Russian oil exports dropped 43%, from 4.072 million barrels per day to 2.318 million barrels per day. Only 22 tankers departed from Russian maritime ports during that period, 15 fewer than the week before. According to Bloomberg, the Kremlin lost more than $1 billion in export revenue in a single week. And then on March 31st, drones struck U.S. Teluga for the fifth time in 10 days, hitting the oil processing terminal and further complicating Russia's ability to move its primary export commodity to market. Here is the geopolitical irony that makes this story even more significant. At the exact moment these strikes began hitting hardest, global oil prices were rising due to tensions in the Middle East. The price of Russian Urals crude at Baltic ports climbed to $73.24 per barrel. The SPO blend reached $84.19. Shipments to India were valued at nearly $97.69 per barrel. Russia was on the verge of recording its highest oil export revenues since May 2024. And then the drones came, and that windfall evaporated. Ukraine did not just strike infrastructure. It struck at the precise moment that infrastructure was most valuable to the Russian war machine. If you are finding this analysis useful, take a second right now to subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel covers global geopolitics with the depth and precision that you are not going to find in the regular news cycle. Now back to what is unfolding. The military and strategic pressure from these drone strikes is now registering inside Russia's own information space, and that is significant. The Institute for the Study of War reported on March 31st that prominent Russian ultranationalist military commentators are beginning to openly discuss the need for a rapid end to the war in Ukraine. One well-known commentator stated that the economic potential of the West is orders of magnitude greater than Russia's, and that Ukrainian drone strikes represent a growing existential threat to Russian infrastructure. He went further, arguing that Russia cannot produce enough interceptor missiles to compete with Western economic capacity, and that the country is therefore doomed to defeat and must immediately solve the problem of how to end the war. These are not voices of the liberal opposition. These are figures from within the pro-war ultranationalist space, people who have spent years demanding more aggression, more territory, more sacrifice. When those voices begin talking about defeat and urgency, it marks a qualitative shift in the internal Russian conversation. A blogger within the same space noted on March 26 that Russian forces will not be able to reverse the unfavorable battlefield situation in the coming months, that Ukrainian counterattacks have been quite successful, and that Ukraine has surpassed Russia in drone technology adaptation. The blog also criticized Russia's military leadership for being slow to respond to Ukraine's evolving drone capabilities. These are admissions that would have been unthinkable in the Russian information environment just 12 months ago. And then there is the sixth development, which adds a dimension of deliberate escalation and psychological warfare to everything else happening. Finland's authorities confirmed that two drones crossed into Finnish territory on March 29th, with at least one of them identified as being of Ukrainian origin. That detail initially pointed the finger at Kiev, but on March 31st, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha, speaking alongside EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas in Kiev, stated clearly that Ukraine has intelligence confirming these incidents are deliberate Russian provocations, not navigation failures. We can say with certainty that in all these cases, these were deliberate and targeted actions by Russia, Sybiha said. According to Ukraine's intelligence, Russia is redirecting drones intentionally toward Baltic states and Finland to generate propaganda incidents, create friction between Ukraine and its European partners, and undermine the alliance's cohesion at a moment when unity is more important than ever. This is hybrid warfare in its most cynical form. By using electronic warfare systems to hijack or redirect drone navigation, Russia can manufacture incidents that appear to implicate Ukraine, damage its diplomatic relationships, and cast doubt on Kiev's reliability as a partner, all without firing a single identifiable Russian weapon across NATO borders. It is manipulation of the information environment through the physical world, and it is precisely the kind of operation that conventional military analysis often misses. What does all of this add up to on March 31st, 2026? It adds up to a world in which two major military conflicts are simultaneously approaching critical inflection points. In the Middle East, the United States is signaling it wants out of a war it started on terms that may or may not materialize, while Iran holds firm on its demand for something more than a pause. In Eastern Europe, Russia is absorbing unprecedented damage to its economic infrastructure while its own nationalist base begins to crack under the weight of military failure. Ukraine is hitting harder, smarter, and farther than it ever has, and Russia is struggling to respond. And in between all of this, a shadow campaign of drone manipulation is testing the cohesion of European democracies at their most vulnerable point. These are not separate stories. They are one story, told across multiple theaters, about what happens when the power of the post-Cold War international order continues to fracture in real time. What do you think is the most decisive factor right now? American disengagement from the Middle East, Russia's internal fractures, or Ukraine's drone strategy? Leave your answer in the comments. The conversation happening down there is often more insightful than anything you will find on cable news.